ever had someone be blunt and direct, and you were later thankful that they were so honest with you? On the other hand, have you ever had someone soft pedal the truth or undersell something and what was required just because they wanted you to calm down or they wanted to get you to do something? And it felt in the end like it was a bait and switch. You later found out that the thing was way more serious or demanding than you'd been led to believe or expect. Well, this kind of thing happens pretty often, and we appreciate the truth because it helps us prepare. I remember my high school cross-country coach, Jim Fraser. We affectionately called him Senor because he was also the head Spanish teacher in my school. He was a Quebecer by birth and a former Pan Am Games high hurdler for Team Canada in the early 1960s. And he was a taciturn figure with a craggy face who cut his salt and pepper hair in a crew cut and had an athletic physique which even into middle age was all muscle and tendon and bone with no fat. He was not afraid of intense work himself, and he drove his runners hard early in the season to get our mileage up in order to build a good training base for sharpening once the season came for racing. He was kind and encouraging, but he made no effort to be popular if it meant sparing us the truth about the fruit of hard effort, team spirit, and progress. We appreciate the bluntness, you and I, of teachers, coaches, and other leaders. But when it comes to our spiritual life, sometimes we have a mixed reaction to the bluntness in a religious leader. Now, it's true that we have less aversion to bluntness in a leader or advisor that we've come to trust, and that takes time. And it's the situation with Jesus and the 12 disciples, which is who that Jesus is speaking to in our reading for this morning. They have spent some time together and come to trust Jesus more and more during the period of his ministry in Galilee. So it's possible that they're ready for what he's going to say in a way that you and I might not be ready to hear what he has to say. We might be unpleasantly surprised by Jesus' words here. And aside from disregarding them or dismissing them, we really don't know what to do with what he's saying here or how to take it. The late novelist David Foster Wallace is reported to have said, "The truth will make you free, but not before it's had its way with you." We may not like pain or hardship, but we're willing to undergo both in order to achieve a worthy goal or help make our corner of the world a better place. I mean, during this time of the pandemic and the riots after George Floyd was killed, and in the steps people are taking toward speaking the truth and hearing the truth about race and white supremacy, people have really stepped up in ways that they never have before. We just have to be convinced that it's worth the pain and effort. So Jesus is speaking this kind of truth to his disciples in our passage today, which is really a series of sayings that Matthew, the gospel writer, stitched together to make it look like one long teaching. Jesus probably didn't say every one of these things all at once as part of a speech or a sermon. But Matthew made today's passage part of a larger section in which Jesus is preparing the 12 disciples to go out on their first mission, where they're going to be doing what he did in Galilee, preaching and teaching about the kingdom of God and healing people and delivering them from their demons, something that was going to turn the world upside down and that eventually set people on edge, particularly if they were in positions of power. But right now it seems harsh and hard to listen to, even in a rendering of it like The Message by Eugene Peterson. It feels as if Jesus is being blunt just simply for its own sake, so much that it takes the focus off of what it has to say about how we are to live and how we survive and even thrive in the middle of difficult circumstances. It all feels like we get focused on Jesus' tone and the difficulty of what he's saying, and we can't take any nourishment from it. Instead of a pep talk, it seems like what we would call manufactured religious misery. But what if I reframed his remarks by saying that what he's doing is trying to manage their expectations, which you might agree is one of the qualities of good, effective leadership. He wants them to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And then, if they're not tortured or martyred on their first missionary journey, they'll come back and be grateful for still having their lives. The stories that they will tell will be about what they were able to accomplish, and they'll be excited and ready for the next challenge that he throws at them. So Matthew writes his version of the gospel later in the first century for a group of Christians who knew every day the threats of hardship and persecution. It can be very helpful to us in terms of understanding a passage if we know enough about the original group of Christians it was written for and what they were going through. On the one hand, this group faced pressure from the Roman Empire to worship Caesar, the emperor, as though he were a god, rather than Jesus. And on the other, they felt the pull of the family ties and religious traditions of their ancestors in the Judaism that they'd grown up with. They weren't yet being martyred in large numbers, in other words, killed for their faith, but they were being tortured, and they were getting a lot of pressure to recant their faith in Jesus from both sides, from the religion they had left behind, as well as from the Roman government. And part of the reason why was that the religious and political powers that be were in cahoots with each other. The Roman government had extracted a promise from the religious leaders that they would stay in their lane and refrain from drawing social implications from the Torah on behalf of those who were poor or didn't have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. In other words, they said, you can have your religion, just don't upset the social order or mobilize the poor to revolt. In their view, religion was best as an anesthetic that numbed people to their pain and kept them in their place. So Matthew's Jesus is blunt with his disciples about the hardship part of the mission on which he's sending them. He had seen the people they were encountering in the Galilean ministry, and he saw that they didn't have a leader and they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. They had no one to empower them or tell them their lives could be different or help them claim their ability to change their own lives. Life just seemed to happen to them, and they felt like victims. Jesus eventually saw that he alone couldn't accomplish this mission with everyone who needed it, and so his disciples were ready, even if they didn't think so, to share in this ministry, and he set about training them and mobilizing them to join him directly in this ministry of transforming people's lives and even transforming the society. The conditions that faith communities face right now in our own time have become more similar to the stark choices that Jesus and Matthew's people faced than they ever have before. Those of you who are in your 70s and older may remember a time that was as divided as this period in history. I think particularly of the summer of 1968. But for many of us who are younger, this is our first experience of really seeing religion co-opted by politicians in such a blatant, life-threatening way. You and I have to find a way to live day by day with compassion and courage in the face of white supremacy and corporate and minority rule and incivility in the way that we speak with each other. It's hard to know where to start in applying all that Jesus is saying in today's reading. So it can all seem rather overwhelming, like where do I start? That's why I'm going to suggest that we go back to the way it was probably taught in the first place and break it down into its individual chunks, maybe one or two of which we can internalize and begin to integrate into how we live. Like the part about it being enough that a disciple is like the teacher. We don't have to be the teacher. We can be like the teacher. And we're all in a position of learners. Or the part that talks about all the times Jesus says, have no fear, that God is ultimately in charge of our lives and cares about us. Kind of like I explained in the children's message this morning, where God cares for all the hairs on our heads, no matter how many or how few there are, or the birds of the air, or even the fish in the lake. Or what about the part about leaning into the challenge Jesus poses to the long-held ways of thinking and being, like racism and poverty, the things that we sort of accept because we never think that they will ever go away. They're just part of life. Jesus is saying, lean into those and challenge yourself to become part of the solution. Or dealing with family ties, how complicated those can be. Or learning what it means for each of us to take up the cross. What is that for you? What is that for me? Or lose an old life in order to gain a new one. What is that we need to let go of in order to be transformed? So if you break it down, go for one or two instead of the whole schmear. This might not seem quite as overwhelming, and it might be more useful to us. It also helps us to hear stories and examples of what this can look like in practice if it's actually lived out. Ellie Krug shared this story this week in her newsletter, The Ripple, about Whitefish, Montana, population 8,000, and majority white. They too had a Black Lives Matter protest. Among the small group of protesters was a 27-year-old biracial woman, Samantha Francine, who held a sign that read, "Say their names," about African Americans who had lost their lives in police violence. A 51-year-old white man, Jay Snowden, approached the crowd and began yelling obscenities at the protesters, including a priest. Soon, he was towering over Samantha, screaming within inches of her face, and Samantha stared back, not batting an eye, not even faltering a little bit. After way too many seconds, Snowden finally moved on to yell at another protester. And Samantha later recounted that at the moment of that confrontation, she thought of what her father, who died when she was 11 years old, had taught her. He had said, no matter who the threat is, no matter what the threat is, you look them in the eye so that they know you're human. In that moment, she said, I felt those words, and I saw fear in Snowden's eyes, and I knew that he wasn't going to hurt me. Eventually, police removed Snowden from the scene and later charged him with disorderly conduct. Public support for Samantha poured in after the incident, and as Samantha related later, I've gone through so much, experienced so much in the last 27 years, and in that moment, everything I've gone through suddenly made sense. God can use our life experiences, even our attempts at trying to live a little more like Jesus, to deepen our ability to be nonviolent, to speak the truth in love, to not return evil for evil, and other things. But the story about Samantha doesn't end there. She said she had no malice in her heart toward Snowden, and she demonstrated it by delivering a gift basket to Snowden's wife to show that she understood that his wife didn't embody her husband. Ellie Krug says that this story underscores how some white-collar Americans are fearful of much-needed change, but it also shows that the pathway forward is not through anger or vengeance, but rather through compassion and grace. And I would add, at the same time, that violence in the form of uprisings like we've had recently is understandable, and it is the language, as Martin Luther King said, the language of the unheard. But it also is not a recipe for a lasting change. We have to find a way to stay engaged with each other. And in order to do that, we need to hear Jesus' words, fear not.